All right, so I'm going to start with our land acknowledgement. MIT acknowledges Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. And so now I'm really pleased to introduce Christine, who is the executive director of the Center for Urban Pedagogy CUP, a New York-based nonprofit whose mission is to use the power of design and art to increase meaningful civic engagement in partnership with historically marginalized communities. Over the last 10 years, she has led CUP from a small local organization to a national recognized leader in the community engaged design field. Christine earned master's degrees in architecture and city planning from MIT. Following MIT, she was assistant director of the Gulf Coast Community Design Studio in Biloxi, Mississippi, where she provided architectural design and community planning services to low-income communities of color recovering from Hurricane Katrina, and first began to understand the ways in which design is a tool of power and that designers must choose in whose hands they place that power and how. In 2009, Christine became the first non-founder executive director of CUP. She partners with designers and community organizations to create visually based educational tools that help demystify complex issues impacting their communities, from zoning law to immigrants' rights. The projects are designed with and for community organizations to help increase their capacity to mobilize their constituents on social justice issues that are important to them. CUP's print, audio, video, and digital projects, along with tactile interactive workshop tools, are used by dozens of community organizers and tens of thousands of individuals in New York City and beyond. The projects have been featured in art and design contexts such as Cooper Hewitt Museum's National Design Triennial, PS1 in the Venice Biennale, and recognized with the Cooper Hewitt National Design Award for Institutional Achievement, the Curry Stone Design Prize, and the National Arts and Humanities Youth Program Award. Christine has taught courses on design, civic engagement, and community planning at SVA, Parsons, the New School for Design, the Pratt Institute, Mississippi State University, and Boston Architectural College, and has lectured about community engaged design throughout the US and abroad. She's a founding member of the Design Futures Student Leadership Forum Advisory Board. So Christine today is going to present for about the next 45 minutes or so, and then that'll be followed by an open question and answer session. You're welcome at any time to post comments or questions in the chat, which I will be monitoring, and then Christine will respond to those at the end. So please join me now in extending a warm welcome back to MIT to Christine Gaspar.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here in my apartment. It'd be more fun to be in, 10485, but I'm happy to see you all today. And thank you so much for the land acknowledgement. I'll just say that I'm calling in from Brooklyn, occupied land of the Canarsie and Lenape. And, I note that to acknowledge the ongoing colonization of this land, as well as the continued contributions and presence of Indigenous people in the region today. And as someone who's in the space of kind of graphic design and communications design a lot, I also really want to lift up the work in that field of Indigenous designer Sadie Redwing and her contributions to helping us all understand tribal visual sovereignty. I really encourage looking up her work. I think she's really phenomenal. And I share this acknowledgement also to remind us of the ways in which our tools of design and planning have been used to uphold and perpetuate histories of oppression against Indigenous people, as well as Black, Brown, and other people of color, migrants, and other people whose identities have been marginalized. I think only in naming those histories can we start to define ways to use our tools and skills in ways that counter oppression and work towards liberation for everyone. I know that I'm not in that place yet in my work, but I guess I invite us all to work towards that and also to help each other get there and kind of hold each other accountable to working towards that. And so I think for the rest of this time, I'd like to share some of the ways that we're working towards that direction. And maybe I'll start sharing my screen. Let's see. Whoops. Okay, great. So I'm going to start with this image. Does this image look familiar to folks? Have you seen something like this before? Yes, some nodding. Yeah. Also, this is such a small group, so I feel like if you ever want to just like, I'll ask questions sometimes, and if you want to just unmute and respond, please feel free to. But yeah, this is a flight safety card image. I'm sure we've all seen them last time we were on a plane, whenever that might have been. And yeah, what's it for? Does anyone want to say, what are these for? Feel free to unmute or chat. It's the purpose of a flight safety card.
Is it a liability thing? You have to give it so that people will hopefully read it.
Yeah, it's but you want people to read it, right? Because it's meant to save people's lives, right? It's to help. The idea is it'll help people survive if the plane crashes or something bad happens like that. How many folks think that these are effective? Show of hands. I can't see everyone. I'm seeing some of these. We're not sure. So if anyone thinks they're effective, can someone say why they might be effective?
I think people generally know that they're there, so they're effective in that I would grab for it if something happens because I know it's there.
And of the folks who think they're not effective or maybe are skeptical, do you want to say why you think they might not be effective?
I think for me, I traveled a lot as a kid, but I didn't learn what this was until much, much later. So I don't know that it made sense for many years. I don't think it did.
Cool. Yeah, so it's kind of one of those things where it's like, maybe it's effective, but probably not if you don't use it, right? So it turns out that they're actually extremely effective, and they've had a huge impact on helping people survive in instances of a plane crash. And I'm going to talk a little bit about them today, but they're not that CUP works on them, but I'm going to draw some parallels to what we do. But there's a really great episode, if anyone listens to the podcast 99% Invisible. They have an episode that's about these that's really phenomenal. I think it's called In the Event of, I can share the link at the end also. But anyway, it turns out, so when air travel started becoming really widespread in the US in the 1970s, the death rate in crashes was extremely high. And it turned out that most people are actually surviving the crash, but that they died because they couldn't get out of the plane quickly enough. So flight safety engineers did all these studies to figure out like what the obstacles were to that. And they ended up doing stuff like adding more exit doors, but most of the issues were behavioral. And so it was really about helping people understand what they needed to do, and in a way that then they could actually do it quickly enough. And so then the challenge really became about how to communicate it. So early efforts to do that included, crew announcements, which obviously we still have today, and then flight safety cards. And when they first started doing flight safety cards, they kind of look like this. So if you think you're not reading the cards now, for sure no one was reading these, right? Like lots and lots of words. They kind of started to look like this, like you start to see like at least like an image of the plane, and then like maybe more detailed images of critical equipment that you would need to understand. And then a little bit more like this. And then finally like this, right? And this is from the 70s, as you can tell by the fashion choices, but we're basically still in this space, right? This is what they look like now. Like they're heavily graphical, and they show both like the overall plane, and then like certain details throughout. And they've really evolved to actually be truly effective. But again, it depends on whether or not you actually read them. And what I guess what I'd like to emphasize here is that when it really matters to communicate with people across language, culture, literacy levels, we recognize that the best way of doing that is through carefully researched visual language. And while people often treat visual communication and design itself as things that are, extra or nice to have, but not critical, that we at CUP understand that it's kind of the other way around, right? The visual communication is necessary, and that we think it shouldn't only be applied to preventing deaths and plane crashes. We think that excellent visual communication can also save lives by helping people, find, afford, and keep adequate housing, get paid what they deserve, live free of harassment, abuse, and denigration, access quality healthcare, and just meet other real basic, needs that are critical to our lives. That's why we use these methods to create visual explanations that make it easy for people who've experienced oppression and been excluded from civic decision-making to understand their rights, access services, and participate in democratic processes that are important to them when it's important to them. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about our projects and how we make them. And at the end, I'll kind of come back to this and talk a little bit about some of the maybe more specific techniques that might be useful to think about when you're doing this kind of work. So all of our projects are multidisciplinary collaborations with a whole bunch of different folks at the table. I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of who we usually work with, and then I'll give you examples of our projects. So our projects start with our staff, but what our staff don't do is we don't kind of sit together and figure out what topics we should work on or what work we should be doing. What we do is we create the infrastructure for our project. So we, make sure our staff are all trained in the techniques and methods that we use. We make sure that we have the funding in place to do our projects. We do a lot of outreach to community partners so they know what our work is and they know that they can come to us when they see that as a need in their own work. And we sort of set up all this infrastructure, and then we do outreach to get our community partners. And I'm showing a street vendor here. This is a project that we did with a group called Street Vendor Project, but we really are partnering with community organizations and advocacy groups that are working, that are in and working with and part of historically marginalized communities and who are working on issues that are important to them. So for us, this issue of self-determination is really critical, that we see communities as, they're identifying the issues that are important to them. They don't need someone to tell them, what their problems are, but they also have solutions. And when those solutions would benefit from skills that CUP has, we want those groups to know that they can come to us and that we'll work with them, but we're really trying to decenter our work and center them, right? And so we see our work as secondary to theirs. Sometimes we talk about our work as a resource ally model, which is kind of framed in that way. And then the third piece of all of our projects is the designers. So the kind of visual thinkers. We work a lot with graphic designers, illustrators. We also have youth education work, which I won't talk about today, but I'm happy to answer questions about. But in that work, we work a lot with teaching artists as well. And so we always have these three sets of folks at the table throughout our projects and all of our meetings. We also have community members, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But for us, each of these roles has kind of different skills or expertise that it's bringing to the table. And though we're multidisciplinary, we don't do each other's disciplines, but what we do is try to frame a space where our disciplines can come together and we can talk to each other in a language that we can all understand, which, is not always the easiest thing to do when you're working with designers and organizers, right? And we're all talking in different ways. And that we make sure that we're all working together to bring our understanding to the issue that we're working on so that we can create something better than any of us could do on our own. And then we make some sort of a visual tool that then we get into the hands of the folks who need it. And so that last piece is where all the impact happens, but how you design the whole process of getting there really determines how that impact can happen and how effective it can be. And so for us, that really starting with a community partner, their understanding of the issues, both in terms of oh, this is that policy, but this is also what's happening on the ground with it. This is what's going wrong. This is what people's lived experiences, and having them bring community members into the process to tell us that, right? So we understand it from their perspective, but that also so that when we're creating text and visuals throughout the project, we're sharing it with them and getting their feedback on it so that we make sure it works for them, that it resonates with them, so that ultimately, when that street vendor is holding that in his hand, that he trusts that thing so that he can actually act on the information inside of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, we have a couple of programs that I'll talk about where the work is a little bit different from each other, but they all sort of have that same framework. A lot of our programs are structured to have open calls where we really want groups to be able to find us, and especially groups lower capacity groups who might not be able to, like know that they could get a grant to come work with us, right? We want them to be able to just apply to work with us. So we have a lot of open calls, we do a lot of outreach, and we invite applications from both community organizations and advocacy groups that have social justice issues they're working on, and also designers who want to collaborate with us on projects as well. We usually have juries to help us pick, and for us, it's about thinking about how you have accountability structures built into your work. So we both have, internal accountability structures that we like to think about, but we want to have external ones too. So the jury is a way for us to have folks who are leaders in the organizing and advocacy world and in the art and design world help us pick our collaborations, ask really hard questions, help us really be thinking critically about the applications, but also like having like a larger understanding of the field and what's happening so that we can bring that lens to our work as well. Most of our projects start out looking like this. I always say it's like policy in the wild. This is a page from a really great policy that we have in New York. It's our state rent stabilization law. And this is one of very many pages that look like just like that. And it's a really great law, but not surprisingly, like some of us with the flight safety card, no one reads this law. So it's hard to know what your rights are with it. And the consequences are real, right? People lose their housing. And with rent stabilization, not only do people, like if a family is evicted, they lose that apartment, but often the apartment comes out of the program as well. So future families that could have benefited from it lose that opportunity because it's illegally pulled from the program. And in neighborhoods where there's real estate pressure, which in New York feels like everywhere. I think everywhere it feels like everywhere now. There's a lot of incentive for landlords to really harass tenants and try to push them out. And so we were seeing in Chinatown a few years ago, a lot of tenant harassment where landlords were really, they were turning off the heat in the winter, they were locking people out of their apartments, they were doing illegal construction, they were basically just trying to harass people to leave. And on the one hand, people didn't know their rights. And on the other, this is a largely immigrant community. A lot of people didn't speak English in a way that they felt like was proficient enough to go fight with their landlord, or they were worried about retaliation and like deportation threats. So, it's like tremendous imbalance in power in this neighborhood. But fortunately, we have really amazing organizing groups. So CAV, Organizing Asian Communities, came to us. They applied to work with us through Making Policy Public a few years ago on this issue. And they do a lot of street outreach and door knocking, and they were having a really hard time talking to people about the rent stabilization law and what their rights were. And they really wanted to make a tool that would break down some of the critical pieces that could help people right away, and also do it in a way that helped them see the power of organizing and how other folks in their community have been effective at actually getting wins through this law. So we collaborated with them and with a design group called Intercollaborative. And a lot of our work just looks like this. It's like messy meetings. I guess they look a little different because now they're on Zoom. But there's just a lot of conversations with, the organizer, which the person in the white shirt is Jason Chan. He was an organizer at CAV. The two people next to him are member leaders. So they're community members who are involved in the organizing in their community. And then two folks from the design team, and then a couple of staff members from CUP. And it's really just these spaces where we have conversations where we really try to get, get everyone speaking the same language, and also make sure we're really understanding the issue, we're understanding people's lived experience, and that we're creating design that is responsive to that. And so I'll give an example of in this project, like in all the projects, CUP staff do a lot of the facilitation, right? Of trying to create a space that feels safe for everyone to be vulnerable in, and that where we have trust with each other, but also a space where we can just be honest with each other. So sometimes people are grateful that we're doing this project. They don't want to be critical or negative towards the designers. Sometimes we have the opposite problem, but there's just a lot of stuff to manage in terms of personality and conversations. But in this project, the member leaders were speaking Cantonese with Jason, and he was translating for us. And he sort of at some point got nervous about what they were saying and didn't know how to say it. And it was really important to us to be just be honest with us, because this project is going to be bad if we don't tell each other the truth. And when we ask for design feedback, we really often frame it as tell us what's wrong with this, right? And I was trained in architecture and urban planning, and never in my architecture education did I hear anyone say that when they were in a critique, right? You sort of start out by telling everyone how shiny and neat the thing you made is, right? And for us, it's really about like, hey, you know how this thing works or what's happening. Please tell us what's wrong with it so we can work on it, right? And really inviting the feedback. And so at some point, Jason was like, all right, well, what they said is that it looks too Chinesey. And we're like, fantastic. That's really not what anyone wants. Like, let's talk about what that means. And the designers were horrified, right? That they thought that they'd, done something really offensive. And we sort of backed it up and talked about, and the reason it came up was because of the way they were showing the buildings, like what the buildings look like. And we sort of said, okay, what about it? Like, what are the elements of it? And we started talking about what would make it feel like it reflected their neighborhood, but was also like a contemporary reflection of what their life is actually like as people like living in like, New York City in the 2010s, right? And we ended up having this really great conversation about what buildings look like in the neighborhood and then coming up with this design approach. And so one of the things that came out of that was that there's a lot of like yellow and red signage throughout Chinatown. And so the designers really picked up on that as like a thing that they would use throughout. And then they used the sort of like tenement building architecture throughout because this was Project Art, Brand, Civilization. So it was about the buildings and how they worked. So this is the project. So, again, one of the conversations we actually talked about a lot with the community members too was how to frame it. So Cav said, oh, like we have these conversations and it's really hard to walk up to someone and start talking about how rent stabilization law works, surprisingly enough. So we had a lot of conversations about, well, how do you start the conversation? Like, how do you invite the conversation? And for us, we talk a lot about like, oh, where are people at? What's their starting point? Like, and sometimes for a project, it's like, they don't know anything about it. They've never heard about this thing. And sometimes it's like, oh, they actually have all these misperceptions about it because they've heard all these like rumors and stories that may or may not be real and they don't know what to think. Or sometimes they've interacted with this system before and it was awful and they had a really bad experience, right? And so you have to sort of figure out where we're starting and then where we're going to try to take them to. And the starting point here was, people were talking about the neighborhood getting expensive. They were talking about people getting pushed out. Like that was very real to them. And so we started with that, like, why is Chinatown getting so expensive? And sort of like, well, actually, these things are related to that, but this is a way to start that conversation and build towards understanding these laws. And then we used a lot of illustrations to really show as much of the information as possible, or that when we were talking about different parts of the law, to show it like in that part of the building where that would apply. We work a lot to have really simple text that's really straightforward. Often, and I know this from my own personal experience, my parents are immigrants. And when I was a kid, my mom was constantly handing me things from like the doctor or from like a city agency and asking me to read it for her, and like, maybe that's why I do this job now, but those are really hard things to parse. And so we think about that too. We're like, okay, let's assume like a literacy level that's more accessible. So we know we're going to catch more people with it, but knowing that maybe some of those people will be kids who are actually reading for their parents. And in this project, it's bilingual. So the text is also in Chinese. That varies. We have different projects that are in multiple languages. Sometimes you do different editions in different languages. But so this is the poster side. There's also stories in it about successful organizing efforts that other members of that particular community have had. And then this is CAV using the project in some of their street outreach. So like their immediate feedback to us was like, oh wow, people like come up to us when they see it and they want to look at it and they take it out of our hands and they're interested in it. But they also, over time, were successful in getting several major actions across entire buildings in Chinatown with using this tool in their organizing. So they had folks that were able to fight their illegal landlord harassment and actually get the landlord forced to sell the building to a different landlord. And they were able to stay in the building. So we're seeing like real organizing success coming out of this work. We were also able to do a little follow-up project that was taking some of the core content from that poster and putting it on a subway poster that we had throughout the city. And that one was in English and Chinese and Spanish, and also like listed a bunch of different organizations where folks could get housing support. I'll just show a couple of other projects from this program. This is one that we did that's helping nail salon workers know their rights, both around like safe labor practices and also getting paid what they're supposed to legally, that we did with a group called Adhikar. This is a project we did with a group called Black Women's Blueprint that's about the rights of survivors of sexual assault who are women or trans, gender nonconforming folks on college campuses. And this is a project that I think touched on something that we talk a lot about in our work, which is representation of people, and how, how we respectfully represent like different like racial or ethnic identities or abilities or body types, right? We're often talking, we're using the visuals to really make people feel included and seen in the project so that they can trust it. But we're also, sometimes our designers struggle with like, oh, if when I do illustration, I'm trying to like essentialize something about a person, but that feels like, it can go into caricature. So we spend a lot of time both talking about what it should look like and how to think about that, but also doing a lot of audience testing to make sure that we're really making it appropriate. And in this project, it was important to show like a lot of different gender identities, but it was also focused on primarily Black students. And when we had this conversation about showing a range of like skin tones, which was like an earlier draft of the project, the audience members said, oh, it actually feels like it's harder for me to relate to it because it starts to feel more specific. And we ended up having this whole conversation about using the variation and the illustration on its own, and instead putting the drawings on like a textured paper. So that was interesting to me because I think there's other projects where that wouldn't have been what the group wanted to do. And so I think it's important to like really work with the needs within that specific community. This is another spread from that project. And this is a project we worked on more recently called Not on Our Watch. And it's about e-carceration. So it's about how like more governments are using things like, like ankle monitoring. And a lot of times people are talking about it as a way to put fewer people in prison. But in fact, it's actually casting like a larger net around the number of people who are being surveilled. And obviously, not obviously, but maybe obviously at this point, that's happening disproportionately to Black and brown folks. And so this was a project that's really talking about those dynamics. And this is like one of the spreads from the project, really trying to show like the different scenarios and then talking about alternatives to that. Those projects that I just talked about are really kind of long in scope. They take a pretty long time to develop. So we created a program several years ago called Public Access Design that has projects that are sort of shorter in scope that we could turn around more quickly. And one of the ways that we came up with to do that was to actually every year put together a group of designers as a fellowship that then would stay with us throughout the year, and then we can pull them onto new projects when we get them. But one of the things that really did was also push us in our thinking about training designers and the ways that we're supporting designers to really show up in this work. And that's something that I think, especially in the last 2 years, we've been focusing on a lot more in terms of really giving designers training around thinking about, like, we have a whole workshop we do around bias and illustration, and talking about even like how to show up in some of these challenging conversations, how to receive feedback. And that's an area that we're really developing further as we work with so many designers, and they really want to be doing this work, but I think design education is really missing that component of it. So public access design is a space where we're, again, doing a lot of training of designers. We have a jury that also helps us pick both the designers and then the community partners. We have a cohort of fellows. We meet with them quarterly and do a different training with them each time, and then also have them work on projects throughout. Some of the trainings are things like having them, this is them meeting with a community organizer, so having them really understand organizing and how it works and how design can actually contribute to it and support the work of organizing. This is, again, I have so many pictures of lots of people sitting around tables looking at drawings. But this is a project we did with a group called New Immigrant Community Empowerment, or NICE. That's the designer, you can tell by her MacBook. Caroline O, showing some images to staff members from NICE and then also to community members. And this was a project about wage theft for Spanish-speaking day laborers. So the two community members are day laborers. Caroline did this really great thing where she asked community members to bring her photos of their job sites so that she could use them for the actual drawings and like really incorporate both specific details of their experience, but then also images of them into the project. So again, like really making sure that it's speaking to the audience. These are some of the spreads from that project. And that's like, it's a little pocket guide. So it's about this big, so you could actually carry it with you and keep it in your pocket. And it talks about your rights, but it also talks about what to do if your rights are violated. And again, you could do a pamphlet that says those things, but our goal is really thinking about what are the ways that we're enabling the understanding of that to be deeper, where it's easier for people to actually access that information, right? And like look at their job site and understand how that works in their context, but also make it so that when they get to the point where you're talking about this is what to do next, that there is a sense of trust there, right? Especially for people who have historically had, negative interactions with public institutions. This is another project we did in that series. This was about getting your possessions back after you've been arrested, which we did with a group called the Bronx Defenders and Designers, Liz and Lee. And they, this project was interesting because after we did it, they came back to us a year later and they said, oh, can we do an update? And we said, oh, is there something wrong with it? Like, was there an error or something? And they said, no, we've been trying to negotiate changes to this policy with the city for years. But after we made that project with you and we showed it to them, it was the first time they actually understood how it works. And then it actually changed the conversation. So we were able to negotiate changes to the policy. So we just want to update it with like the new rules. So it was really interesting. And often our projects have this sort of duality where they're meant for like a particular group of users, but they're often also used in policy conversations. And I've had multiple projects that I've worked on where a partner has said, even, for example, I was working with a group of folks. It was a big coalition that had an affordable housing platform that they were working on together, and they'd been organizing for months and months. And I started working on an outreach piece with them. And one of them called me afterwards and she said, we had a big fight in our meeting today. And I was like, oh no, what happened? And she said, no one knew what the platform was until we saw your drawing. And we all realized that we were assuming different things about it. And when we saw that drawing, we realized where we had disagreements that we had to work out. So that was, sort of unfortunate, but I guess good, like better to have that happen before they went public with the platform. But we see that happen a lot, right? It's really hard to actually understand the details of these things in a lot of ways. And then here's another project from the Public Access Design Program. I don't know if folks may have seen this. It's been, a lot of people have been sharing it lately. But it's a guide that we did with Hollaback about bystander intervention. That they've been using in their trainings and kind of handing out to folks. But again, it's a little pocket guide so you can carry it with you. And we're actually working with them now to do, to get funding to do some translations of this so we can make it available to more folks. So that's that. I'm gonna now talk about another program we have called Envisioning Development Toolkits, which are more kind of hands-on workshop tools that we developed in partnership with organizers. And they really came about from organizers saying, there's issues that we talk about, year in, year out. We're always talking about affordable housing and what that really means. We're talking about how zoning works in New York. We're talking about ULURP, which in New York is the land use review process that the city uses. And like people are constantly having to scramble to understand those things, and they're very technical. Some of them have really quantitative components to them. We want to do something that helps people kind of remember it in a way that they can hold on to more, so that they feel confident going into, like a public hearing or going into conversations with developers about what's happening in their neighborhood. And so the first one we did was called What is Affordable Housing? So it's this hands-on workshop tool that really helps people understand the definition of affordability, the way that the government uses it. But then also lets them use, these are little felt pieces that you can just put up on this big felt chart. But it lets people see like who lives in their neighborhood and like what their income levels are, and then look at the affordability programs that are relevant in their neighborhood and how that relates to who actually lives there. And, often there's this disconnect, but it also lets people look at like proposed affordable housing and see who it would house, and have these sort of more nuanced conversations about how the policy actually works. It comes with a booklet that helps people understand the policy, especially if they want to run a workshop. And then you could say, again, using like really simple graphics to get at these ideas. And then the back has workshop instructions for someone who wants to lead a workshop. And we do a lot of training of organizers to use these toolkits. We also do a lot of workshops with our staff as well, running workshops in different settings. And let's see, this is what it looks like. We're super literal about our toolkits. They're like big, colorful plastic boxes, which is nice if people see them and they're happy to interact with them. And all the projects in the series have a lot of tactile interaction. And, we've learned a lot about embodied learning and how people are, like in all of our work, we're sort of trying to create these maps, right? Like a mental map through this information so that you can hold on to it, right? And that's something that we know there's a lot of research showing that can be really effective. But then the embodied learning piece is like people really can internalize more of that information if they're like physically interacting with something when they're learning that information, which I think is really interesting and kind of exciting. And like, oh, right, we should all be more like kids in our lives. But we really tried to think about the mechanics of that in the workshop and having like a sense of discovery and then, kind of remembering and then talking through those things. And I'll show you actually in the next toolkit, I'll show you, there's a lot of that as well. This is the project in action that's like being used by a whole bunch of different folks. We're actually in the process of updating the content. Actually, some of you may be friends with Rajan Hoyle, who's working with us now on his DUSP sabbatical to help us do some of that work. This is our, this is New York City zoning code. This is what they do when they make it visual. We have some critiques of that. And its usability. So we have the zoning toolkit. This is how we do it. This is like a little guide. This is like a handout we have in the zoning toolkit, and it's just looking at the different land use categories in New York and really trying, again, to create a sense of like an intuitive understanding of it when you're looking at it. And obviously that's not the full picture, that's not all the details, but I think it helps give people a sense of the basics, and then they can dig into the piece that's relevant to them and really get a sense of what's happening there, right? It gives them an entryway into that, again, with very little language. This is the toolkit. It's actually a game board, and it uses plastic blocks. And so on one side of it, the one that has like the little squares, we explore land use and how you think about different land uses and what goes together and what should be in a neighborhood and things like that, sort of these bigger things. But also like we have these activities that walk people through what it feels like to what happens when like people each make their own decisions, and then what happens when you have sort of like a framework for that decision making, and then also what happens when you change a land use category and people individually decide whether or not they're going to make a change in response to that, and you can see sort of how neighborhood change can happen very quickly. So again, that sense of like physical interaction and embodiment. And then the other side of the board walks people through sort of more of the massing pieces, so the like height and setbacks and all those pieces, so you could see why neighborhoods end up having kind of the shapes that they do. This is the booklet that goes with that. So a lot of illustrations around kind of buildings, also little stories like historical moments in zoning, but moments where there's been, like changes, or like, especially ones that had like a lot of like community interaction with them, or communities were successful in organizing for change. And then here's the workshop in action. This one's really fun because you put it down and you give people blocks and they just immediately start engaging with it. So it's always nice. We really think a lot about play and humor in our work. It's not always appropriate because we work on some pretty serious topics. But we think a lot about when, I'll talk about this more at the end, but when people are laughing and playing, they're very receptive to learning, right? That's how our brains work. And so there's a lot of power there. We also have an online component that goes with this. So there's like a little kind of FAR tool that walks you through like the massing pieces. I think the URL is whatisfar.org. We also did, New York has been going through a lot of rezonings during the de Blasio administration, and we created these more customized sort of interactive activities called What's the Trade-Off around for each of the neighborhoods that was going through rezonings, and really helping them have conversations as a group about, understanding what was going to happen, but also understanding what their community priorities are and like talking about those together and having a framework for that. We're doing more, so I talked a lot, these are the programs that I've been talking about are the ones that are more structured, but we've also been doing more like work for hire outside of that, where groups are coming to us and asking us for more specific things. This is a project we did with a group called the Center for Family Life. This is a poster, but we also did a workbook for them for parents who are at risk of deportation, understanding how to set up guardianship for their children. And then we did a workbook helping them have conversations with their children about that. That was after the 2016 election, when Trump came in and there were like ICE raids happening all over the city. So, I think for us, I hate that we have to work on most of the projects that we have to work on, but I was happy that Center for Family Life trusted us with this work and came to us to work on it with them. And, I think we're seeing more of that happen too, where people are coming to us with these needs that are emerging, that are really critical to them. We've been doing a series of tools that I think will come out this year with the Center for Court Innovation, funded through the Department of Justice, that are a series of children's books and graphic novels helping kids between the ages of 2 and 18 who have to go through court processes because they've been victims or witnesses of crimes. So especially and we're also doing a sub-series that's specifically for kids who've experienced trafficking. And that's been really incredibly challenging work to do, but I feel like really important work, and we're glad that we've been able to do it. And it's also pushed our work on everything else, because we've learned a lot about, understanding a trauma-informed lens, and trying to understand healing and how those things can be parts of our work, and really just seeing opportunities to bring that lens into almost everything that we do, into our interactions with community members, into the way that we're framing things in our projects. And, certainly there's places where that already aligns, but I think it's helping us bring a different depth to our work. And I think that's a really interesting area to think about. We also have a couple of more meta projects. This is a project called Dick and Rick, a visual primer for social impact design that talks a little bit about, the ways that we do this work, and also sort of having a conversation with other folks in the community engaged design field. So let me see, I'm gonna come back to this now. So we're back to our flight safety cards. So I really loved that episode of 99% Invisible, and I was listening to it, I was thinking a lot about some of the things that they did to really make those things work that are so aligned with what we've been learning at CUP, and it gave me a way to think about sharing those out with folks. But I'll say some things that I've already said, but I think it's helpful to just hold these. But one is that, these projects to be effective really start with recognizing where you are. And in the flight safety cards, their first step is helping people understand where they are in the cabin, right? So that they can orient themselves. That orientation piece is really critical. In our projects, I sort of call that the point A of where we're meeting our audience member and understanding their perspective and where they're coming from. And to do that, we really have to reframe information from their perspective. And often we're being told oh, this is a rent stabilization law, it works like this, and that's the way that it was written by the policymakers, but that's not the way someone experiences it in their life, right? Something's happening and they're going about their life, and then all of a sudden this thing is around them. So really trying to understand that situation, and also communicating to folks from the beginning why they should read this. Why does this apply to them? Is it for them? Is it in their language? Does it look like it's about their neighborhood, right? And is it talking about a system or a thing that they know about? And often we'll go to our partners, who are organizers, and so they're doing this work already, but they'll be like, oh, we should call this blah, 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 whatever the name of the law is. And it's does anyone know that that's what the law is? They don't. They know that they feel like they're going to get evicted, right? So let's talk about that. And we spend a lot of time kind of trying to find that point A, trying to find where people are at, and really talking to them about that, and also the right appropriate ways to frame those things. Yeah, and so maybe an example of that is, I'll just show a couple of quick examples now, but we did a project when the Affordable Care Act passed. We did this project helping people get access to it, but it was really targeted to folks who'd never had insurance before. So part of what we had to do in the project was even explain, help people get through misconceptions about what insurance was or how it worked, right? And we've all heard so many horror stories about insurance, so really helping people understand what it meant so they would feel empowered to then engage with this information was a really important piece of it. The next piece is being very clear about the purpose, right? So flight safety cards had this really, really clear, it's we have 90 seconds to get this many people off of this plane, right? And that determined really specific details about even how the evacuation works. Apparently the reason that you don't, when you have to use those evacuation slides, you're not supposed to sit down inside, you're supposed to jump onto them. That's just so that there's enough time to get everyone off. So there's these really specific ways where understanding what you're trying to get to help you make decisions and trade-offs, right? And in these projects, right, we're writing about a particular law, for example. We're not going to write the whole law, right? We're really going to look at the pieces that are really relevant to people in these situations. And so really understanding where we're trying to get folks to is so critical to determine what content we create, how we write about it. If people can remember 3 things about this, what are the 3 things they're going to remember, and also understanding how they're going to use it, and what that interaction is going to look like. So for here, I mentioned this project before. This is a street vendor project. When we were talking to the vendors, an earlier iteration of the visuals were more like more cartoonish and like playful, like a little bit sillier. And the vendor said, you know, part of the work, part of how we are going to use this is we want to know the laws so we can follow them, but we also want to be able to show it to the police, because often they're writing us tickets and it's not, we haven't actually violated the law, but they don't know it either. And we want to be able to have it look official enough that if we show it to them, they'll believe it. So again, like really understanding that, like where this project is going and where you need to take it is going to determine how you shape it. Another piece is to match the actual details of real life. So in the airplane safety guides, right? If the door handle that you have to pull in an emergency is bright red on the plane, then like it needs to be bright red in the drawing, right? That's a very specific detail. I mean, in our projects, the tone and the content has to match people's lived experience. Like if it's too idealistic or doesn't reflect their experience of that process, then it's untrustworthy. And so we can't describe just how this thing is supposed to work, but we have to show that we understand where things may be different in their experience, so that we can, can encourage them to like, take advantage of the rights and push it towards how it's supposed to work, but also understand the reality of it. And we have to show what the details of people's lives look like and that we have an understanding of that. This is a small detail, but this is a project that we did with the group that was about worker co-ops. And it was showing like a dog walking co-op, and an earlier iteration of this had just shown people like in casual clothing. And then this is the person that's like working for the dog walking company, but the dog walkers were like, no, we have to wear uniforms so that other people feel safe around us, right? And so we had to show that understanding, not just because it's a detail that's like more accurate, but also, there's like a real like racial justice critique that's embedded in the understanding of why, these like people of color in this immigrant community have to like make themselves look safe to other people, right? And so like understanding that dynamic was important in that project. And then related to that, basing the projects on real people. I think I showed examples of like some of the ways that we think about how we show people in particular, but yeah, we want to make sure that like in flight safety cards, they really like, they actually take photos of people like doing the actions and then do the drawings to make sure that the body looks like how bodies work in real like physics of the, world that we live in. But in our work, we're often thinking about this in terms of like how we're reflecting people back to themselves so they feel seen and they feel welcome, like especially when we're showing marginalized identities, like showing things like race and ethnicity and class, like showing like gender identities. And this is a project we did with the Alliance of Families for Justice. And for them, this was geared towards like a predominantly Black community, but they really wanted to show like this fullness of like Black identities, right? That we didn't want to perpetuate stereotypes about what Black people look like or who they are. They wanted to show this like, diversity of ages. They wanted to show diversity of like abilities, and just like a range of folks. And that was really important to them, right? And so we spent a lot of time thinking about these drawings and like what each person would look like and who they would be and reflect that real community. This is a really interesting one. So in the flight safety cards, you will note that they never show like flames or smoke or things that would be happening if you actually had an accident. And that's like partially because, it would make the images crowded, but it's also intentional because they want you to process this information in a way when you're calm, right? And that, and to stay calm while you're processing it and not really be thinking about what could happen. And there's a real purpose to that. So people can't learn when they're scared, right? When you're scared, your brain is triggered. You're in like fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Your heart rate's up, your adrenaline is coursing, like you're not reflective. So just the way your brain is working, it's hard to absorb information, especially really important information in those moments. So, but we also find that designers sometimes when they work on our projects, they're really struck by the sense of like how scary this is or how confusing it is in these systems, and they sometimes want to reflect that back. And we really try to talk them through that and say like, people are experiencing this scary thing. Like you don't need to show it to them. What you need to do is make a space of safety for them to process this information and think about it. And so this was a project we were doing that's about, it was for parents who are incarcerated interacting with the Administration for Children's Services. So like they've had their, they've been separated from the children at this point, and they're trying to understand what their rights are and how to engage with the system, where there's a huge power imbalance. And the organization we were partnering with has like really demonizes ACS when they talk about them. And so they like these images where we're sort of showing this like cycloptic monster as the agency. But, we were really talking about how that can undermine the project, right? That people are already experiencing this sort of terrifying thing. Like we don't want to trigger that when they're looking at this. But it also diminishes their sense of agency and control, right? Like we want people to be able to act on this information. And so they have to have a sense of agency and power, that even though they understand that there's an imbalance here, that they still feel a sense of like, I can do something. I understand my rights. I'm going to act on them, right? And having that sense of like, well, it's a monster and it's just going to eat you anyway. Like, why bother, right? Like that's really important for us to, we want to hold the reality that this can feel difficult. And we have to say that, but we don't want to make it feel hopeless. I think this one's pretty straightforward, but on flight safety cards, they use as few words as possible. You can't assume a shared language or literacy level, so you rely on images to speak across barriers. We face many of those challenges too. So we try to have as few words as possible. We need to show more than tell, and where we do tell, we want to help support the creation of these sort of like mental maps and like diagrams and associations that are memorable to folks. And then, test it with real people. So one of the things that actually makes flight safety cards really effective is they're really rigorously tested with folks to make sure that they communicate effectively. And for us, it's really critical to work directly with members of the audience that we're trying to reach. And we see that as one of the expertises that needs to be at the table in our projects. We compensate people for that participation. So we pay them to be part of our conversations and testing sessions. We think that that's really important. And again, like we always, like for us, in this project, the designs are not going to be right from the beginning. Like they're going to always be wrong because we don't know everything about that situation. And this is like a whole side thing. I have like a whole critique of the way empathy is talked about in these spaces often, because I think it's used as license to have a couple of conversations and then speak on behalf of someone. And I don't think that's appropriate. And I don't think you can do it. And so for us, it's like, okay, let's get our assumptions down. Let's start drawing stuff and then let's test it and find out what's wrong with it so that then we can actually learn and make it right and surface things that we wouldn't know about because we don't have access to know about them. And so for example, on this project, we worked with a group called AHRC, whose community is people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And it was a project on how people can get independent housing instead of living in group homes. And when we were working with them, we had a lot of conversations with their community members about how they wanted to be depicted. And they had this really strong feeling about wanting to be shown as having agency. And they felt like, oh, you see people, when you think about disability, it's like a person in a wheelchair and there's people around them who are able-bodied doing things. And like the person in the wheelchair is like sitting there. And they're like, I have a job, like I ride the subway, I have friends, like I want to be shown living my life. And so, which was amazing. Like we had these really great conversations about it. And the designer, when this was like one of the illustrations from the project. And when she did this, one of the things that came up was like, oh, here's a person, she has agency. She's like, she's controlling her door, right? She's opening the door. And that's a huge thing, right? Because you're in a group home, you don't have control of your space. So she's opening the door and letting someone in, but it's like a medical worker. So there's still this sort of paternalistic, like someone's coming to take care of her. And so they were critical of that. And we ended up changing it so she's letting a friend in. But one of the details that stayed that was in the previous image is these keys. And the designer initially had drawn it just to show, so you could tell that it was the inside of the apartment. But the community members loved this detail so much because for them, it was like, I've never had keys before. Like you don't have keys in a group home, right? Like you get locked in, not out, right? And like that symbol was so, it just to them spoke so much about agency in this really deep way. So it was really interesting to have, these like really deep conversations with folks so we could get at details like that. And all of those things are about making the project more effective, but they're also about creating trust, right? So there's trust that the information is right, that this person who's holding it is being seen, their experience is being reflected, trust that they can use this information to actually do stuff, right? That's huge, right? Especially folks who had historically had relationships of distrust with institutions. Yeah, and that what we really want people to be able to do, like the flight safety card, you want people to be able to get off that plane, right? And we want people to be able to like keep their housing, get their benefits, have their voice heard in a public meeting, you know, get healthcare. And it's not getting you out of a burning plane, but those things are maybe as important in many people's lives. So thank you. Here's where you can find all those projects that I just shared, and I'm happy to answer questions now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christine. There was, I really appreciate hearing such detail about the projects and the tangible examples of how learning is happening and how the projects evolve. I think there's already some question or two that has come up through the chat, but let's kind of open it up. I think Christian is not here, but he left a question. Would anyone else like to ask a question to start?
I'm happy to answer the question in the chat too.
Okay. I'll read it for you and you can answer. So Christian had said, I'm really interested in the iterative process CUP community members and designers engage in when creating toolkits. Can you talk about tried and true techniques or processes you use when creating a toolkit, or is it different each time?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a general framework that's the same across the project. And I think for the toolkit, I don't know if they're talking specifically about the hands-on toolkits, but I can talk about those because they're a little bit different than the other projects. For those projects, they have taken us a long time. Like those toolkits have taken like 2 or 3 years to put together. And usually it's, the bell is ringing very loudly. Usually it's like a long phase at the beginning of research. And that research is both like, let's understand the laws. What does the city say about this? Let's actually read the zoning code. Let's read like all the guidance that's on the Department of City Planning's website, but then also talking to all the stakeholders. So talking to, like when we did the ULERP toolkit, there are like 8 different voting stakeholders in the process. And we just went and interviewed all of them, and really understood from their perspective how they think ULERP works and asked them all these questions. And that was really interesting. And then we also talked to a lot of community organizers about their experience, like organizing around that issue and the challenges that they've had in their communities. And then once we have like all that research in place, we really start to think about, and this comes a lot from the organizers as well, like what are the key pieces of content that they want to make sure people learn and that we want to prioritize. And then we just start to think about like, okay, what's a way for someone to experience learning that content that isn't just me telling them. And we really come up with incredibly stupid, bad ways of doing it. We test them out internally in our office and then like kind of keep coming up with different approaches and just testing them out. So we do it internally. And then when we sort of feel like we're getting to a place with them and we can, sort of prototype something or, mock something up quickly, we'll start doing kind of test workshops with our community partners. So we really just try to get stuff in front of people. And with the appropriate framing, right? And I think for us, like how we use people's time is so critical. Like we don't want to waste people's time. We really want to pay people for their time. We want to frame it so it's like, hey, this is the stage that we're in. So this is the kind of feedback that's going to be most useful to us now, right? It's not like, it doesn't look pretty yet, so don't worry too much about how it looks. It's more about like, did you get that information? Was that too confusing? Is it too long when we do that activity that way? So we try to give like space for general feedback, but then also ask really specific questions to get through that. And then we just test it out a whole bunch and then we go into like a production phase. For the other projects, it's similar. It's like, getting stuff in front of folks quickly and getting feedback on it and really creating the frame for how to give feedback and empowering people to give feedback. And like I said, a lot of it is just inviting critique, but also often people are not used to talking about design, right? It feels technical to folks. And so we really try to break it down. And like one thing that I think about is if you look at something visual, it has all these things, there's like typography, there's illustrations, there are colors, there are, spatial layouts, there's hierarchies of information. There's like a lot of things to see, but people will look at it as a totality and sort of be like, I don't know, I guess I like it, or I kind of don't like it. And so we want to get their general reads, like, what does it remind you of? Like, do you have associations with this? And then, often that's productive. Like someone was telling me about a project once where people kept feeling like they didn't really like the text and they couldn't figure out why. And then they realized it was like this typeface that's on the side of like police cars. And it was like, yeah, don't use that. Really. So there's so we spent a lot of time just sort of helping folks like, trying to get them to read the reactions, but then also asking them really specific questions about like, what do you think about the color over here? Or we do things like comparative conversations are incredibly helpful, right? So we ask designers, especially early in the process, to have a couple of iterations to look at. And so we could be like, oh, what do you think about the color over here versus the color over here, right? Or what do you think about like what do the words look like on this page versus this page, right? And we try to like get through those, or we start to name like, oh, this illustration style uses these like dark black outlines, and then it has this sort of like fuzzy coloring that looks maybe like it was done with a paintbrush. What do you think about that? Just like explaining what it is, and then people like can start to use those words to engage in the conversation too. So a lot of it is that. And I think more and more now we're talking a lot about just even the framing of the space and creating safety in the space, both for the designers to get stuff wrong, because I think especially, I think it's become scarier and scarier for them to get stuff wrong, like especially around things like racial and ethnic representation. They're very scared of getting that wrong, but they're also like, there have been times when we've had designers be called out on things where they have had a really bad reaction. And I think it's like, right, it's like, it's not just like, oh, my design was bad, but like I'm a bad person now, and so I'm shutting down. And so we're trying to really support them with like framing ahead of the project and like how to show up in those moments, but also trying to think more carefully about how we create the space of safety for everyone so that we can get stuff wrong, because we need to get stuff wrong to get it right, and like really making a place for doing that, and that's internal and safe, right, and that's not out in public.
I was hoping to just jump in on that point actually, because Christine, you have a background in design, and you are also you teach in design as well as all of this work. And I think a lot of the things that you're talking about, the design process, are almost antithetical to design education, or the way that we teach, architecture and urban design. And I guess I was curious to hear a little bit about that. Like a lot of the work you do at CUP sounds like it would be very helpful to do in a school setting. And does this kind of factor into the way that you teach, or can you see a way that some of these workshop sessions you have with designers in terms of learning how to fail and put things out there and actually say, this is not right, so let's make it better, as a way of working? How could that kind of work into educational settings?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. And like we've been seeing our role in that more and more now, right? In the way that that we have a role in supporting designers. And we've been doing more. Actually, this bias and illustration workshop that we created for the designers we work with, we held as a public workshop last year, which was interesting. And I think we might do more of that kind of thing. But yeah, I agree with you. Actually, there's a part in the workshop at the beginning that's like a critique of design education, like the sort of whole white supremacy culture built into it. But I know for me, like it took me, like I mentioned, I grew up, I'm white, but I grew up in an immigrant family and like kind of lower income. And when I got to architecture school, like I felt so shut out of that space and felt like I didn't belong there. And I literally had a faculty member say to me at once that she was like, if you don't get it, then like, I can't tell you. And it was like, I think we have different understandings of what education is for.
Yeah.
But to me, like that, and that's quite a while ago now. And I'm hoping that those things have changed. And it was to me, it was also so different than my experience in DUSP, which was very much not how I felt, in that space. Like, I think I felt very, included there. But, I think some of the assumptions of design education, like, just really have to change. And I think they are, I guess, from what I'm hearing, I think students are pushing for those changes as well. But I do think that idea of like, of the assumption of like what design is and what it's for, like that idea of just sort of like presenting like this perfect solution to anything just feels it does feel antithetical to what design can be and what design is doing when it's actually solving problems. I know folks at DUSP have been talking about design futures, but I'm really involved with that program. And I think it's really amazing. And I think it's creating a space and design conversation that's very, very different. And that's really trying to center some of these ideas and trying to understand how like design can work towards liberation.
Right. Thanks. Iran, do you want to ask? Oh, sorry.
He was just
Iran
saying bye.
Yes, right. Yeah. Is there anyone else who wants to ask any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you so much, Christine. That was so inspirational. I feel like I just started a masterclass on something. But yeah, I wanted to ask because I think your work is really inspiring to me. I work as a community artist in Chinatown here in Boston, and I think a lot of my work is working with residents, and I feel like there's a lot of resonance with what you said. And I think one thing in particular that you talked about was the work that that these pamphlets and books that you're building help to empower people to feel like they can make an informed choice. And I was wondering if you can maybe speak more on like what aspects of the design or even the relationships or anything, other components of the work that you feel like really affect, I don't know, like can make that possible.
Do you mean in terms of like what we're making in the design, or do you mean like the process or?
Yeah, any component of it is sort of like, what is, yeah, I don't know, what you feel like can help, yeah, it makes it possible for folks to kind of come out of that experience, reading the pamphlet or, and then feeling empowered. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, to me, like a big piece of it is how like we can frame it from like the beginning. Like, I always talk to staff, like we always design the covers like last, and our staff often just leave the content blank off of the cover. And I'm always sort of pushing folks to say, like, well, what of your content can go on the cover that will help people like just even know to look here or want to look here and feel like it's talking to them. And I just feel like so much of even that piece of it of like, of it's not, like a document from the city is always going to be like, rent stabilization 101, like rent stabilization, and like, I don't want to be like, I understand the city has to do different things than we have to do. So I recognize that. And I also think in New York, there's often folks that are doing really amazing stuff within the city, but just like the framing of it is so different. And partially, I think that in their perspective, it's also like, it makes it more universal, but I feel like often this isn't universal, right? That it's not, rent stabilization doesn't apply to everyone, right? And that we can look at who it affects, right? Or who is more likely to experience like discrimination within that, right? And then frame it around that experience. And I think so much of what we're doing is like that people are just feeling like something was made for them, and that says a lot to them, that they know it's not just a government document, but it's like talking to their experience and how rare that can be. So I feel like that's like a piece of it. It's just even like having that understanding and then that clarity in the way that you're showing it to folks. And yeah, I just think about, even in our staff, like, again, we talk about it all the time. I think like it's easy to like fall into the like, oh, it's about this, but it's like, I want someone to look at the cover and be like, is this for me? Oh, that is for me. I know that that's for me, and be able to look at it. And then like on the flip side of that too, I think that there are times when if we don't do that, then someone might look at it thinking they're going to find an answer that's for them when it's not for them. And then you wasted their time, and I don't want to do that either. I think those pieces of it, but I think like the conversations around representation are so important too. And like literally asking people like, how do you want to be shown? Like that conversation with the folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, they had such strong opinions because they had spent so much of their lives not seeing themselves reflected back in that way, right? And they had a lot to say about it. And I think, we're having conversations that are more explicit about like, what are stereotypes that we should be sure not to perpetuate, in this project, and like bringing that. We're also bringing more of an intersectional lens to it too, because sometimes we're working with a community that's like not thinking about disability, and so that's not showing up in the projects, but like we can bring our lens into it and ask to like represent disability, because it exists in all communities, right? Or thinking about like gender identities and how they show up in every project, right? Or even things like norms about family types and things like that. So we're trying to think about that as well.
Christine, I have a question regarding government entities, particularly since you mentioned the city. So, some of the designs and some of the materials that you're proposing go directly against what city or official entities are proposing or depicting. So I'm curious to see if, or to learn if the center has ever been in a space where you have to manage the politics between, doing something that is relevant and useful to both an official entity and to community members in a way that sort of brings them together, as opposed to, separates them or divides them further?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like we could talk about a lot of things in that. We've actually done work for city agencies too. So I can talk about that. I don't think I showed anything today, but yeah, it's a really interesting question, right? And like government entities are complex, right? Because they're an entity, they're part of a city, but they're under an administration. So they're going to do different things under different administrations. But then there's also people who've been there for a long time. And then at the end of the day, they're made up of people, like they're actual people. And like, we know a lot of those people and they know us and, they've helped us. And like there's so many people in the Department of City Planning who I know use our materials and are excited about them and see relationships between our work and theirs. Like the city has this fantastic, they actually have this really fantastic zoning workbook. But it's like, we think of our zoning tool as like zoning 101 and like that workbook is like 201, but they complement each other and we think it's awesome, right? And then there are city agencies that like I would say we're less aligned with and that, that I think are doing more problematic things. But I'm interested, like personally, I do think we have to be careful about that line. And partially it's that I think we should always be empowering in the way that we're talking about stuff. And I think we should always have on the table that there's room for change. And I think the groups we're working with are pushing for change often in those ways. And, in our projects, we try to hold both like, this is how the system works now, but these are also things that could change or ways that it could work. And I think there have been moments where I think we've probably been a little more critical than others. I think that project that I showed that was showing ACS in a really negative way. I think the final project that we did is better than what I showed you. That was like a process image, but I think it's the final thing that we did is still like a little bit problematic. Like I don't know that ACS would feel like good about what we did in that particular project. I think that's okay, but I also do think about, like how do you hold space for a bigger understanding of what agencies can be and can do and how they can change? And I know that change can be slow, but we did a project on public benefits several years ago where when we were finishing the project, there was an administration change and the leadership of it was about the Human Resources Administration in New York City. And when we were finishing the project, there was a new leadership there. And it was someone who had come from the organizing sector who was now in leadership. And so we ended up actually working with them at the end of the project and they used the publication that we created. And to me, like, that's just a win, right? And the project that I showed that we did with CAV around rent stabilization in Chinatown, the Department of Housing Preservation and Development came to us and said, can we make a citywide version of that with you? And at first, we sort of were like, oh, like, what are they going to do to it? Like, how are they going to water it down? And so we sort of went in a little skeptical, but we went in saying, okay, that would be meaningful, right? If that happened. And also when we talked to them about it, we really framed it as like, it's so fantastic that you're recognizing CAV's leadership and seeing the need for this and like really working hard to make this content available to folks. And we're excited to work with you to adapt it if we can also have CAV be part of the project and make sure that they get paid to do that work as well. And they were like, yeah, that's fine. And so we were like, oh, okay, well, that's fine. So we ended up working with them and they actually wanted to add another piece to it because there had been another law passed that actually provided additional rights that they wanted to add to it. So we worked with them to do that. And then we ended up making it in like, I want to say like 10 or 12 different languages. And so just to see that was so meaningful, right? And then we ended up doing another project with them that was about helping people prepare to apply for affordable housing because they had this big affordable housing portal that you can apply through and like people would apply and then their number would come up and they wouldn't be ready, like they wouldn't have all the documentation that they needed or they actually wouldn't qualify for some other reason. And so they really thoughtfully said, we want to make this guide that helps people before they're applying so that they get ready, so that if their number does come up, they have a higher likelihood of getting housing. But we also recognize that there's so many more people applying for housing than there are ever going to be units, that we want a guide that if they follow those steps to prepare for our portal, they're actually preparing themselves to apply for any kind of housing, including on the market. Like it's still going to make them stronger applicants for housing. And we were like, wow, that's that's good. We should do that. And so we work with them on that, and that ended up being also like in 20 languages that they use throughout the city. So there's moments like that where, you know, it feels really great. And then there are moments where it feels like, you know, we're very like outside the system pushing at it. But there have been so many times when our work has pushed in and made a change that we didn't expect. And when I talked about the project about people getting their possessions back after they've been arrested, like that led to policy change that surprised us. We've just had other moments like that. Oh, I don't think I showed it, but we did a guide that was a comic book guide to the juvenile justice system for kids that get arrested. And Department of Probation partnered with our partner, and they ended up using that project really extensively. So there's been moments like that where it's like, oh, we might have a critique of that system, but having our tool operating within that system is still feels very positive. I don't know if I fully answered your question. I feel like we could probably talk about it for a really long time.
No, that's great. I think what I'm sort of understanding is they're active decisions, right? Where design can be a little bit more activist, right? Driven, and there are other times where perhaps it's about just giving the information, right, and ensuring that folks are empowered that way. But I appreciate the conversation on the different nuances. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the question.
Are there other questions? I have a few more. Allison, you unmuted.
Sure, I have a question. Thank you so much, Christine, for this talk. It's really interesting and super inspirational. My question is about the thinking behind localizing issues versus making them a bit more general. And you kind of touched on it in what you had just said. But I'm curious, for example, like when you're talking about affordable housing in Chinatown through the CAV project, how much consideration is there, if any, for talking about affordable housing in the general borough or Chinatown in San Francisco as well? I mean, is there sort of intentions of trying to make it very local and very specific to the partner organization and what's happening right there on the ground in that neighborhood versus sort of being able to apply it across different geographies and different contexts slightly? Or maybe this isn't as relevant because it's partnered, you know, there's a specific request by a partner, but I'd love to know a bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and something we talk about a lot. I mean, I will say you're right that we are working with a specific partner and they frame it in a certain way that we then talk about. And sometimes they frame it in a certain way and it's like, oh, we're gonna focus on that, but actually the way that it's framed, it could still apply to a lot of other folks. And so we might talk about that within the project itself. I'm really interested in the idea that like sometimes when you're creating like real specificity, you actually make something that works better for more audiences. And that's not always true, but it is sometimes true. And so the project that we did for CAV is a good example. And you said two things that were really funny because they're things that happened. But like we did that project, and then we did the subway poster because at that time, like so much stuff was happening around rent stabilization, harassment. And then actually the state ended up having a big campaign to address it. And so we did this poster and a lot of people were really interested in it. And we ended up working with like another group to do a Spanish adaptation of it. And so it was really interesting to me that it's like, well, we made this really specific to Chinatown and this like, you know, particular community. But we ended up adapting it with them, and we changed the illustrations, but like the overall, like the building types actually turned out to be the same, and like the laws were the same. We took out the stories about organizing in Chinatown, you know, so there were things that we edited, but there were like core pieces that actually stayed the same. And that was really interesting to me to see like what those were. And then a group in San Francisco reached out to us and they said, we have this same issue. And it's actually happening around like kind of SROs there. And they said, we just got funding from the state to make an outreach tool on it, but we were looking at yours and like literally it's almost the same. Like, could we just work with you to adapt yours? So again, we went to CAV and like, is this okay? And they were like, yeah, that's great. So we ended up working with this group, Mission SRO in San Francisco, to adapt it. And so again, that was like really interesting to me that could work and that was okay for that to work. There's also been times when people wanted to adapt stuff where it was like, oh, the law works totally differently in that place. So we would have to like totally recreate it. So then it wouldn't make sense to just do an adaptation. It would feel like a new project. But there have been moments where, yeah, like things apply more broadly, or groups that weren't the group we initially worked with end up working on using the project themselves. We also do a lot of stuff with like coalitions. So, you know, we encourage our partners to think about that if they're in coalition, to have the coalitions participate throughout so that we're actually making work that they can use as well. But I think I'm trying to think of a good example. Sometimes there are things that are very specific and that makes sense, that they're like more focused and we recognize it's going to be a smaller audience. Like, I think of what's like we just did a project that was for like TGNC folks that have been arrested, like understanding their rights within like the jail and prison system in New York. And that's that's like a very specific context. And we want that to feel very, very inclusive of like a very specific group of folks there. But there's also moments when there's like a larger policy conversation that things can connect you to. And we do some work that is larger scale. Like, and I talked about the tools that we're doing that are for kids going through court processes. That's national work. And so we did like testing sessions like around the country to work on those too. And we're sort of interested in like where, does that work? Is that effective? Like how much testing do we have to do? Like, how do we hold all those pieces?
That's great. I'm just noticing the time right now. So I think we should close just to let people transition in breaks between classes and everything. But I feel like this conversation could go a lot longer. I have a few more questions I'd love to hear your take on, but I'm going to let everybody go. Thank you so much, Christine. This was, I think the work that you do really with everyone brings together so many issues that are important to people here, and there's a lot to learn from. So, thanks so much for your time. It was really wonderful.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure, and so nice to see you all. Nice to see you, Shrimp. Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Bye, everybody.
Bye.